Rhapsody might look like the classic macOS, but underneath it runs a hybrid kernel, the Mach microkernel with BSD extensions. As the bridge from NeXTSTEP to what later became macOS 10 and today simply known again as macOS, Rhapsody didn't yet qualify for official Unix certification. Like many BSD variants of the time, it was considered Unix-like, but not a true Unix. Even its kernel name reflected that. XNU, shorthand for X is not Unix. When development on Rhapsody and the XNU kernel began in late 1996, just after Apple acquired Next for $429 million, nobody could have guessed that the name might eventually feel like a misstep. Because in 2005, with OS X 10.5 Leopard, Apple finally achieved full Unix certification under the single Unix specification version 3. But back in 1999, when Rhapsody shipped as macOS X Server 1.0, that goal, if it even was there at that point, was still light years away. In part 1, we set up this PowerMac G3 and installed macOS X Server 1.0. Today, it's time to explore its quirks and rough edges, zip drive integration, installing applications, chasing a strange anomaly inside the Blue Box environment, applying OS patches, and even wiping out the entire system during an upgrade. Retrocomputing is the use of older computer hardware and software in modern times. I'm the Vintage Collector and these are my stories. As noted in my previous episode, this PowerMac G3 didn't originally come with the optional zip drive. Also, there have been 2 generations of mainboards for the Yosemite G3. There are various accounts about persistent IDE issues with the first generation board, which seem to prevent the use of secondary IDE hard drives. I can't say for certain if that also applied to other IDE devices like zip or CD-ROM drives. In my case, since this PowerMac has the second revision mainboard, it worked just fine. I simply set the jumper on the zip to act as the secondary device on the same IDE channel as the CD-ROM drive. And before we continue, here's a quick thank you to PCBWay for supporting this channel. If you've been following along, you know they're my go-to for custom PCBs and 3D printing. For September, they've added some neat specials. Get the purple solder mask for your PCBs and no extra cost, or benefit from up to 80% discount for TPU material in 3D printing. The links are down in the description. And now back to Rhapsody to see how that one handles the zip drive. Luckily, no extra configuration was needed on the OS. Once connected, the drive was instantly recognized by Rhapsody, also acknowledging the disk being inserted. But since it was formatted with the DOS-FAT file system, Rhapsody couldn't read it, only offer to format it. At this point, Rhapsody's file system support was very limited, just HFS and UFS, not exactly ideal for file exchange. Launching into Blue Box, I wondered if there was some compatibility trick to make the UFS formatted zip accessible to macOS 8. But the disk never appeared on the desktop. Maybe because it was already mounted in Rhapsody. I tried unmounting it, but that had no effect. And when checking back in Rhapsody, I noticed it simply remounted the zip in the background. Digging through the documentation in /system/documentation/readme, I found a clue about exclusive disk access for Blue Box. Maybe that would solve it. Sure enough, in the volume mount options control panel inside the Apple Extras folder of Blue Box's emulated hard disk, there was the toggle. Once I enabled exclusive access for the zip, macOS 8 immediately recognized it and popped up the familiar dialog to format the disk. Here I could choose between DOS or Apple's HFS, just as on a regular macOS system. No UFS though, as of course macOS 8 has no UFS support. Switching back to Rhapsody though, nothing had changed. It still didn't recognize the disk after formatting, offering to reformat it instead. Long story short, Rhapsody can do HFS and UFS, macOS can do HFS and FAT. And even though Rhapsody itself doesn't offer HFS as a formatting option for zip disks, the macOS 8 running inside Blue Box does. That at least works reliably on the Rhapsody host, so in practice you can use the zip drive as a bridge for file exchange between Blue Box and Rhapsody. Another trick is to rely on extra disk partitions. As I mentioned in my previous episode, I ended up repartitioning everything when I rebuilt the machine for a true multi-boot setup. And luckily, both Rhapsody and the guest macOS see those additional partitions, which makes sharing files between the two environments a lot easier. And that's already a big help. When we looked at SoftPC and SoftWindows a few weeks ago, we saw the built-in file exchange feature in action. Apple's earlier Unix system AUX also allowed concurrent access to both the Unix partition and the Macintosh partition. Even the Macintosh application environment for Unix gave direct access to the host Unix file system. Blue Box, however, truly isolated as it was, had none of that. It also lacked any GUI-driven configuration tools. The only way to add storage was through the command line to create a new emulated hard drive file. That was even the recommended procedure for enlarging Blue Box's default disk image, creating a new one, copying everything over, then remove the old one. But on macOS 10 Server 1.0 that really didn't work. No matter what I tried, Blue Box would always fail to format the disk, throwing only this vague error message here. And even if it had worked, those virtual disks were only usable inside Blue Box. There was no way for Rhapsody itself to mount them, so the feature completely fell short as a method for file sharing between host and guest. Apple, of course, released patches for macOS 10 Server 1.0 along the way. At first glance, the 1.01 and the 1.02 updates might sound like minor point releases, but under the hood they were quite substantial. Both advanced the system itself. 1.0.1 pushed the kernel to report as Rhapsody 5.4 and 1.0.2 advanced it further to Rhapsody 5.5. The nice part is that you could install these updates right on top of the already running system without starting over. And here's the kicker. After applying them, Blue Box suddenly behaved differently. The bundled macOS 8 now finally was able to format the extra virtual hard drive. Who could have guessed? Speaking of updates, you may stumble across mentions of macOS 10 Server 1.1. At least that's what some CDs claim, but in reality it was nothing more than a misprint. Apple even acknowledged this on their own support site. Disks labeled as 1.1 actually contained the same software as version 1.0. Perhaps it was just a production error, or, speculatively, maybe Apple had planned a 1.1 release, pressed the wrong media and then decided to retire that version number altogether. Either way, the next real update was macOS 10 Server 1.2, which internally identified itself as Rhapsody 5.6. Released in January 2000, it brought official support for Apple's new PowerMac G3 models. Interestingly, Apple's own system requirements page for 1.2 explicitly excluded the Gigabit Ethernet G4 server models. Full support only arrived later that year, in October 2000, with macOS 10 Server 1.2 version 3, which finally added compatibility for those machines. Both 1.2 and 1.2 version 3 reported themselves as the same Rhapsody 5.6 under the hood, making them more likely incremental hardware updates than true new versions. There are also stories from the time about 1.2 being non-bootable on G4 hardware, forcing users into creative workarounds like installing the system on another Mac and then moving the hard drive over. Meanwhile, I wanted to see how far I could take this Blue White G3 and whether I could lift it from macOS 10 Server 1.0 all the way up to 1.2. However, when inspecting that CD-ROM, I didn't find a way to seamlessly upgrade the current version. So booting off the 1.2 CD-ROM will end up again in a macOS installation environment, this time round based on macOS 9. Though again, this looks like a full setup to me and not an upgrade. And indeed, I'll end up with a freshly installed system which basically wiped out everything I had before. So I had to start over, even re-adding a second virtual hard drive to the Blue Box environment. And guess what, even so it finally worked before on the patch macOS 10 so 1.0.2, the disk formatting issue inside Blue Box has reappeared again. Anyways, as I was running with extra disk partitions at this point already, not a big deal. Still, installing classic Macintosh applications on Rhapsody required you to do so inside the Blue Box environment. It's very much like if you were running soft Windows, where your Windows applications ran confined inside the emulator window. Let's compare that user experience with the one seen on macOS 10 10.0, where Office 98 of course runs also inside the classic environment. But the seamless integration makes it appear like a native application directly on the OS X desktop, even so the window decorations give it away as a classic application. Speaking of applications, Rhapsody comes itself with a few bundled programs like some simple games, a drawing program and more. It even bundled a web browser called OmniWeb. And I used the latter to browse an FTP repository I mirrored from the internet. The list of available programs for Rhapsody is not extensive. There's lots of CLI applications, amongst which are bzip2, SSH, Bash and others. There's also a bunch of GUI applications like OpenUp or notably the FTP client R browser. And where NeXTSTEP was known for its stock, that one is missing in Rhapsody. However, Spectre jumps in and brings it back to Rhapsody. While some software is simply distributed as compressed archive and only needs to be decompressed, others like the X-Server Package Max come as package installers with the familiar PKG file extension, a distribution format you'll still find in macOS today. Rhapsody of course also inherited functions from the classic system software like the startup items. Simply drop in your applications to automatically start them on the next login, like for me OpenUp, Spectre and the launch bar. And of course Rhapsody runs Doom, although it wasn't straightforward. Neither the Rhapsody Doom nor the Doom 2 apps worked right away, always failing on obscure errors pointing at sound issues. One complained about the SoundKit framework missing, which I had no clue where to get it from. In a desperate attempt I installed the Rhapsody developer CD as this sounded reasonable to me, but apparently this didn't include what I was looking for. In the end, I simply opened the application bundle from the CLI and ran the Doom binary with the -no sound argument, which made it run, albeit without audio. Speaking of the application bundle, that's something very NeXTSTEP specific. You'll find familiar structures inside, including an info-nextstep.plist file. And while this one clearly gives away its NeXTSTEP origin, it still exists in macOS today as info.plist, although nowadays it uses the XML format instead. Now I wanted to build a true multi-boot system, giving me the choice of switching between macOS 8, 9, Rhapsody and OS X. However, the open firmware on the PowerMac G3 was still in somewhat early stages. It doesn't have yet the graphical boot selector, which shows up when pressing the Option key on later versions. You can enter the open firmware shell by pressing the Option command OF sequence right after powering on. Still, the multiboot CLI command is of no use here either and simply locks up the machine. So I had to find a workaround to achieve what I wanted. The trick was to register a bunch of def aliases using the nvedit command and persist them to the NVRAM. The individual def aliases, which I named after the operating system to boot, point to the actual disk partition. This way, I can simply enter the open firmware shell and invoke a command like boot macOS 9 to start the desired operating system. You may be wondering, did macOS 10 10.0 really evolve out of Rhapsody? The answer is simple, it did. The lifelines of Rhapsody and macOS 10 10.0 are closely related, and macOS 10 10.0 was clearly branched out from Rhapsody sometime in 1998. Its first developer preview, released just 2 months after macOS 10 Server 1.0 in May 1999, still looks strikingly similar to Rhapsody. At that point, most of the real work had been happening under the hood. Yellowbox was reworked into Cocoa, Bluebox was now branded Classic, and the Carbon API was introduced. Carbon was Apple's reaction to developers' backlash on their original vision for Rhapsody. Carbon provided developers with a practical way to bring existing Mac applications to the new system without rewriting everything from scratch.
Now, what was this Rhapsody thing? Rhapsody was some great technology, some really good technology. And what it was it ran old apps, i.e. Mac apps, and it would run these new apps that would give you all these great new features. The problem was, when you ran the existing Mac apps under this blue box thing, you didn't get any of the new features. And to get the new features, you had to rewrite your entire app. Nobody wanted to do this.
It would take still another year though for the Aqua interface to arrive to give macOS 10 10.0 the distinct look we all remember. Curiously enough, even though Apple had already announced their course correction in May 1998, Rhapsody was still released in March 1999 under the name of OS X Server 1.0. Still, macOS Server 1.0 remained anchored in its Rhapsody and OpenStep roots, not receiving any of the major new developments happening all along in the parallel OS X stream. And Apple still supported it until 2001, the same year macOS 10 10.0 Cheetah officially shipped, marking the true beginning of the macOS as we know it today. As much as the two systems have in common, as much they do differ. With Rhapsody, Apple closed one door and opened another, eventually leading into macOS 10. But its roots go deeper, back to Next and NeXTSTEP. But before we head there in the next episode, I'd love to know your take. How do you see Rhapsody's role in Apple's history? And would you deem macOS X Server 1.0 an unnecessary detour or an all but needed stepping stone? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday.